Welcome to Big Closet Small Planet, made possible by the Laudis Foundation, the Relander Foundation, and Tencel. The podcast is produced in collaboration with Eco-Textile News. I'm Mike Schrager. The impacts from COVID-19 on the apparel sector have been fast and furious. We are all affected. But millions of low-wage garment workers are facing a potentially catastrophic situation as the economy slows significantly and we stop buying our clothes. In this special update, I will talk to a number of experts and union representatives to better understand what is happening on the ground. I'll ask what responsibility buyers have for ensuring workers get paid. We'll discuss what this crisis reveals about the apparel industry's fragile supply chain, and if Bangladesh will ever be the same. We have a really great group of smart and committed people giving us their perspectives today, and I just want to mention who they are so you know who you're going to listen to. Anne-Laure Henry-Greard from BetterWork, Towhidur Rahman, President of the Bangladesh Apparel Workers Federation, Associate Professor Mark Anner, Jenny Holdcroft from IndustriALL Global Union, and Amina Razvi, Executive Director of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. We're very grateful they are all giving us their time today. By the way, Towhidur is calling us using WhatsApp because he's in lockdown in Bangladesh. The audio is not going to be great, I'm guessing, but what he has to say is very important, so we'll have to manage with the poor sound quality. So let's get started. So first off, I want to welcome Anne-Laure. I think it's best you introduce yourself.
And I'm the program manager of a program called BetterWork Bangladesh. BetterWork is a program of the International Labour Organization and the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, which is operating in 9 garment countries, bringing together governments, brands, factory owners, and unions and workers to look at working conditions and to improve the competitiveness of the sector.
So give us an update of the situation. How bad is it?
I think it's quite symbolic that we're talking today, given that this is also the anniversary of the Rana Plaza disaster, today, 24th of April. It's of course a very difficult time for everyone in the supply chain. Cancellation of export orders by major global fashion brands is having a very significant impact on the workers in Bangladesh, on the workers' employment, and on the overall operations of the garment industry in Bangladesh. Just this week, BGMEA reported that 1,145 garment factories lost export orders for a total of more than $3 billion. And that is directly affecting 2.2 million workers, almost 2.3 million workers. So that's more than half of the garment workforce in Bangladesh, since the garment industry in Bangladesh employs over 4 million workers. So obviously this COVID crisis has made those workers particularly vulnerable. And as you know, the wages are already low in the industry. So that means that many workers do not have many savings to dip into right now.
But can you tell us more about how workers specifically are dealing with this? What is their situation?
At the onset of the coronavirus outbreak and government-imposed shutdown, they came back to Dhaka at the risk of getting infected because they were afraid of losing their jobs. These are people for whom the notion of social distancing and confinement is secondary to the imperative of keeping their job and feeding their families. And obviously, this creates a lot of concerns about their ability to practice proper health precautions during the pandemic. Even when they live near the factories, they live in room quarters, in group quarters or in slums with many people in the same room. And going to and coming back from the villages also has means that there's also risk that they might have been infected and spread the virus further in crowded transport. So obviously, As I said, the pandemic is a crisis that is a global phenomenon and has a huge impact on the world economy and on the garment industry across the world. But obviously, the scale is very much felt acutely by the workers. And it's especially true in a country like Bangladesh, where there is a very weak health system and there's virtually no social protection.
So, Bangladesh, given how much of the workforce and exports are linked to the apparel industry, seems particularly at risk. So, via WhatsApp, I have Towhidur Rahman, who is the president of the Bangladesh Apparel Workers Federation, who's on the line now. Towhidur, can you give me a real time update on what was happening in Bangladesh the last few days? Can you give us a sense how serious it is?
The current situation is unprecedented in modern history. Our more than 4,000 garment factories shut down from the last month on 25th, and 4.5 million workers are now in idle. Now they are in the stay at home. This is our current situation. Lot of buyers are saying we are stopping our work order, and please do not produce the product, because we are in trouble in our country, because our retail shops are not opening. Therefore, they are announcing in the media we are not giving any work order more now. This type of news in the newspaper and media. After that, Industrial Bangladesh Council and myself, our federations and other my colleagues of trade unions, we appeal to the brands. Please do not stop our work order, because we are in a trouble. 25,000 workers now is no job. It's a disaster. It's a social disaster for us, because our owners are not interested to pay our workers idly. But in the meantime, our Prime Minister announced a package, incentive package for the garment industry, 5,000 crore taka for the 3 month salary, April, May, June salary for the workers, and this money will not giving to the owners. This money will going to the directly our workers' account. And if it's continue more than 3 months, then I say totally big disaster for the workers' community, because 3.5 million workers are female workers, and they're coming from the rural side. If they no job and no payment, no wages, how they could survive? This is not enough, brother Mike. This is not enough. But this is the small initiative taken by the government. I appeal to the international community, such as brands. Brands have such more responsibility.
Thank you. So Towhidur is making an appeal to brands and the international community. And if you've been paying attention, you know there has been a lot of focus on calling out buyers, brands and retailers, for example, about whether or not they have refused to pay for the orders they've made before the corona crisis. So let me turn to Mark Anner, who is associate professor in labor and employment relations at Pennsylvania State University. He's also the founding director of the Center for Global Workers' Rights. Mark has been following the impact of the virus on factory owners and workers in the apparel supply chain, and has specifically been tracking which buyers have canceled orders and payments to the suppliers because of the sudden economic downpour. And he's been reporting on this. Mark, please just tell us more about what you've been doing.
So I have been researching this topic, and I should preface this by saying I've actually been doing work around or researching the global garment industry now for over 30 years. The first time I ever visited a garment factory was in 1988 when I was living in El Salvador. So I've been following the industry for a very long time in many different ways, and I became very concerned when I started reading about the impact of COVID-19 on the industry in Asia and beyond. And at the time, I was looking at two trends, in fact. One was delay in receiving fabric and difficulties in getting fabric as the uh, virus first hit China. Then we started to see delays in payments as the industry became a bit more disorganized in trying to address this. The final issue was around abrupt and total cancellation of orders and sometimes total putting orders on hold. And I decided to research that particular issue, and I drafted up a survey. It was a short survey, asked it a handful of questions, and managed to get it out to suppliers in Bangladesh over a 3-day period in late March. We got about 312 responses, and I reviewed those, analyzed the results, and wrote up a report. And I was highly concerned by what I saw. In the end, it was over at that time over $1 billion in cancellations. It has since risen to over $3 billion. And the impact was very severe on suppliers. Many suppliers, the majority, about 54%, said they had to close down most of their operations as a result of these cancellations and holds. And from that, there were really dire consequences on workers. Workers were being sent home, laid off, put on furlough without receiving adequate compensation. Other workers were dismissed without receiving severance pay. So this was an enormous concern, and I felt that the dynamics of what was happening needed to be documented.
Mark, can you tell us more about what your analysis has shown?
So when we first did this report, two companies. It first came out. The first version came out on March 27th. Soon afterwards, two companies stated their policy that they would pay in full for orders that were completed or in production. Those two companies are H&M and PVH. We then did a second version, which was put out on March 29th, in which we included an addendum. We noted that H&M and PVH had committed to pay in full, and we then listed 14 companies that had not yet made such a commitment. Within a day, 4 more companies had informed us that they would be paying in full. So by April 1st, we put out the final version of the report, and there were 6 companies on that list. Since that time, more companies have indicated they will pay in full. And I should add, when a company writes one of us and informs us that they will pay in full, for our due diligence, we then write suppliers that we know in different countries, usually starting with Bangladesh, but elsewhere, to get a confirmation and say, we are hearing this from this company. Can you confirm? Once we hear a confirmation from suppliers, again, in different countries, we then put we add that company to the list of companies that have committed to pay in full. So that's where we're at. Now, what we've done is created a tracker. This information is being updated. We are every day or every few days adding new companies to the list of those that have committed to pay. But we're also learning about other companies that aren't yet listed here that have not made such commitments. And if we get confirmation that they are not paying in full for orders that are completed or were in production, we will add those names to that list.
So let's bring in Amina Razvi. Amina is the executive director of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which, for some of you who don't know, is a nonprofit membership organization whose focus is on improving environmental social performance in the apparel industry. And more importantly, the members of the coalition consist of some of the world's largest buyers and manufacturers. There's also NGOs, research organizations, etc., who are members. So, Amina, are you surprised that a number of well-known companies are canceling orders and refusing to pay?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Have I been surprised? And in some cases, yes, and maybe in other cases, no. I think, as I mentioned, this crisis has really put a spotlight on some of the darker aspects of the apparel industry, and for me personally, it's been pretty heartbreaking to watch. One of the reasons I took this role was to really lead the SAC and help create positive change through deep collaboration across the industry. So that this idea of partnership, of bringing brands, retailers, and manufacturers together to really drive collective and collaborative change has been a huge part of the SAC and how we've been successful to date. And I am encouraged to see what a lot of our members are doing in terms of following through on those commitments, shifting resources to not only help their partners, but to also help the global community through the pandemic. But there are definitely some disappointing stories in the mix, and it's hard because there are a lot of real lives that are being impacted across the world. And from my perspective, health, safety, and well-being of global workers is of utmost importance, and it's really integral to the vision that the SAC has of a more equitable and sustainable industry. And it's equal partnership has been a core principle, and we believe that this is a lens through which decisions around these commitments are viewed. And without this partnership and trust, it's impossible to really bring the industry together to address not only this current crisis now, but to really tackle all these ongoing systemic issues.
Okay, so the SAC believes equal partnership with suppliers is an essential part of the puzzle. But apparently, some of the coalition's members are those on the list that have refused to pay suppliers for orders. So, given that it's an essential piece, should they be allowed to maintain their membership in the coalition?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's a really tough question for me. And, it's one that I have really strong personal feelings about, because I think that all brands and retailers, regardless of whether they're SAC members or not, should be following through on these commitments, because as I mentioned, this idea of partnership across the industry is paramount, and it's crucial. And we are a membership organization. I don't know if kicking members out gets us closer to our vision of an industry that's sustainable and equitable. I think it creates more of a divide at a time when what we need is greater collaboration. But it is important for us to be having those conversations and to be engaging with members on, what we not only the principles that the SAC stands for, but what that looks like in practice. And our work with members has always been centered around how we improve performance for all companies, regardless of where they are in that journey.
Okay, let me turn to Mark again. Mark, if a company also suddenly has major economic problems, why should we expect them to pay? They have been affected as well by an unforeseen global catastrophe, what some people are calling a black swan like event. So, why is it their responsibility?
There's different ways to look at that. The first issue, and one that I wrote about in the report, was the use of force majeure clauses, sort of act of God clauses. Now, is that legitimate? Would it hold up in a court of law? I honestly don't know. What experts tell me is, on the one hand, one view is, well, it depends on the clause. How was it written? Does it include pandemics? Some clauses are very general and they might not hold up in a court of law. Others think that the real purpose of force majeure clauses is on the partner that has the greatest burden in the business relationship. So, in fact, these clauses are more appropriate for suppliers and not for buyers. So that would be a decision that would have to be made in a court of law should suppliers choose to go that path. But there's, of course, other reasons that have to be taken into consideration. Many of these buyers have made public commitments to responsible exit. So these abrupt cancellations and order holds would, it seems to me, be in contradiction to those commitments of responsible exit, which includes a slow phase out and so on, proper communication. There's, of course, the ethical issue, and this is one that sort of motivated a lot of my writing and thinking on this topic. When you evoke these force majeure clauses and abruptly cancel these orders and not pay for them, the impact of the suppliers and their workers is absolutely profound. as I put it, workers in many of these countries, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, and beyond, live tiny paycheck to tiny paycheck. Not only do they not have savings, from my research, we find that the majority of workers actually are in debt. So sending them home without income from hours already worked and not income going forward in terms of severance and so on is absolutely devastating, as they potentially face some of their greatest health challenges of their lives, and at a time when food prices in the marketplace are going up due to hoarding and scarcity. Not to have an income at these times puts the well-being of these workers and their families at risk. And finally, I would say too, is the reason, a legitimacy for doing this or not, is the business case. So there's a legal argument. There's these policies about responsible ethics. There's the exit. Sorry. There's this question of ethics, but there's also the question of the sustainability of these supply chains. If these actions are taken in such a harsh way and they're not changed, the possibility of suppliers throughout the global network going into bankruptcy, foreclosure, abandoning the factories, cases where the government, in a sense, would be responsible to come in and sell off old sewing machines in order to pay off worker liabilities, often what happens in such foreclosure cases. It would be absolute chaos. And the point is, at some point in time, the industry will come back. At some point in time, consumers will want to purchase more clothing again, and you need to reactivate those suppliers. So this is precisely the time, I think, where folks need to put their heads together, act responsibly, and leave in place good relationships so that the industry can reactivate later.
Ensuring companies follow through on their commitments is a solution, but it feels like a short-term solution, isn't it? So shouldn't we be asking ourselves, why are these workers so vulnerable to begin with? So I have Jenny on the line to give her perspective. Jenny, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Assistant General Secretary at IndustriALL Global Union, and we represent workers in the garment sector worldwide through our affiliated garment trade unions.
And why is this a problem? And why has your union signed a global call to action?
The rapidity and the impact shows the fragility of the industry and the supply chain model that it uses, how those impacts on factories are felt so immediately, and there's absolutely no cushion. The other problem, of course, is that the production countries, the major production countries in this industry, do not have adequate social security for workers. So if the factories don't pay them, there was nothing to fall back on. Since then, countries have taken specific measures to help to the extent possible, which means for some workers, getting them access to lower levels of income than they would have earned, but still, some income. Again, it's not enough, and it's not going to last for long enough because, who can foresee how long this will go on for? Who can foresee, even when stores start opening, to what extent demand will be suppressed? So I think we're in for quite a long period of lower levels of production than we have seen up until now. But it's going to be very patchy. So there's no substitute for looking at it country by country and seeing what has been the impact on orders, what protections are in place, how are factories able to pay their workers, how long is that going to last for? And that is why we needed to do this global action to say, well, this is an issue for the entire industry. The industry should be supporting its supply chains to survive. Obviously, there's a level of self-interest for the companies as well, because when they start trading again, they don't want to find that all of their supply chain has gone out of business and is not able to produce for them. So we do want to be able to work with business to sustain those factories. And importantly, of course, from our perspective, to make sure that workers are paid during the duration. Who pays for it is clearly a critical issue. brands at the moment who have laid off, workforces, all of the retail workforces, all of the logistics workforces. They're saying that they're not in a position at this time, but we would very strongly maintain that once they start trading again, all of these costs should be built into the cost of the garments, the cost of the orders that they're paying for. And that also goes for a longer term view, which is also what the call to action talks about, which is building better social protection, better social security systems in these countries, and making a garment industry contribution to that, again through the pricing, through the orders, so that there is some sort of a safety net for workers, because we can't expect that there will never ever be any more shocks. There will always be something that happens, and there should be some support for workers over the longer term as well. So that's really what the call to action is about. It's about mobilizing funds to protect the survival of the industry during this period of disruption for however long it may go on for, but also working to build more sustainable systems of social security.
Mark, can you build on what Jenny just said? What three things, for instance, can we do to ensure this does not put workers at such risk in the future?
I tried to keep it to 3 points, but I actually have 4. So let me outline those. I think the first that concerns me is how pricing is done. And we still have some cases, a couple of major buyers that actually use a bidding system to keep the prices down. So whatever, making jeans for $5 each. I think we have to move towards something that myself and colleagues are referring to as total costing for sustainable development and decent work. And what I mean by that is when you set that price point, you have to know with a reasonable degree of confidence that that price point will allow you to cover adequate wages for the workers, living wages, that price point will allow the factory owner to have a building that has the proper load-bearing beams and fire exits and proper electrical safety and so on, other health and safety considerations, that price point will allow for the proper treatment of, especially in textile factories, the treatment of waste and so on, so there's not damage to the environment. And lastly, I don't think this is talked about enough, I think that price point must also include the cost of social protection for workers. Many of these production regimes were set up through export processing or free trade zones that were largely tax exempt. And what happens in a country like Bangladesh, where 84% of your exports are garments, if that key part of your economy is not generating government tax revenue, how can the government be expected to adequately respond in a period of a health crisis? In this case, you have rundown hospitals that needed funding. You also need money for bailouts, money to extend unemployment insurance and other benefits for workers. So I think that's the real key point. We have to get pricing right. We have to make sure we're doing total costing for sustainable development and decent work. The second point I would point to is this question of lead times and order fluctuations. This has become an enormous issue for the industry, for a segment at least that's moved towards fast fashions. Order volume goes up and down pretty dramatically from often one month to the other, certainly from one season to the next. Lead time, the time given to produce the garment and ship it, is getting shorter and shorter. And the result is suppliers, the factories, do not know how to adequately plan for workforce allocations. And they're bringing on more and more contingent workers, often bringing in workers on paying them on a cash basis, but there's no stability, there's no social protection for these workers. They come in and are sent home depending on these fluctuations. So I think the second point is the industry has to improve its forecasting capabilities in order to ensure greater stability of orders over time. It'll be good for the industry, it'll be good for suppliers, and it'll be good for the workers in these factories. The third point, and this would relate it to the other two, I think there needs to be better communication and involvement of suppliers and their workers in these discussions. I think stability and figuring out that right pricing point. When I talk about adequate wages and living wages, I think workers and their representatives need to be involved in those discussions. So there just needs to be a lot more communication on how to do this well. And the last point I'd like to bring in is this question of financial incentives and the financial sector. Investors are torn between two different priorities. One is to increase the value of the stocks they invested in, sort of the bottom line. The bottom line, we know, goes up when costs go down, the cost of goods produced go down, and the prices go up. So there's that push for the bottom line, and the other force pulling at them is the need to do the right thing in terms of social investing. And I think we need to shift the balance more toward the latter if we're going to have more sustainable and more equitable supply chains in the future.
Mark, even with these solutions, do you think after this crisis that a country like Bangladesh will ever be able to recover?
I mentioned approximately, the last I checked, it was something like 3.6 billion, according to the BGMEA, the Employers Association. 3.6 billion was the total amount of canceled orders or orders put on hold. That's an enormous amount of money, right? It affects the ability of those factories to stay viable, to pay their worker liabilities, and so on. But the point is this: Bangladesh exported around 34 billion last year. 3.6 billion is roughly about 10% of that. What happens to the missing 30 billion that they would have earned last year for the 4.1 million workers in the industry? What happens as all these orders now going forward are being shut down? Maybe in some cases, some suppliers I talked to say maybe they could do 50% capacity, opening up with social distancing, different markets that might open up first, and we're responding to online orders, maybe 50% going forward. So what happens to the 2 million workers who lose their employment and are not getting sustained unemployment insurance or furlough pay or even severance pay? It's an enormous concern, and worse yet, if some of those workers start getting the virus. And
has our industry taken more than it has given to Bangladesh?
You have to sort of look more deeply. What has been left behind after 2-3 decades, in the case of Bangladesh, of a country sort of transforming its economy to focus on clothing the world in a certain percentage, right? What's been left is, look at, if you've been, right, look at the roads, the infrastructure, the healthcare system, the education system. I mean, all of them are desperately in need of investment. And there I see the problem being, this is a model based largely on tax exemptions. So there hasn't been a strong stream of revenue for the government. And this becomes a problem when the majority of the 84% we said of the exports, maybe 28% of GDP, is focused on one sector. And you think, sort of a textbook approach to development is diversify, right? Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Build up different capacities at the local level. Support industries that meet local needs, as well as having a segment that's geared to export because you earn hard currency and so on. But have a more balanced approach to development. But a lot of these countries, I mean, governments need to take responsibilities for the decisions they made. But this was a model that was very, very much encouraged by international finance and development agencies, encouraging folks to get into the apparel export sector as a first pathway towards industrial development and so on. But there were limits to the model, and it didn't see just exactly how severe these power imbalances were, and this level of just revenue being squeezed out of the country, going to the buyers, going to the investors, going to people, everyday people with investment funds or consumers that see deflation in clothing as opposed to a normal annual slight increase in prices.
Towhidur, is Bangladesh too dependent on the textile industry?
Yes, of course. If industry will face any type of bad consequences, our whole economy will be collapse. Because you see, the textile industry is related with the cartoon industry. It's a button industry. It's a polythene industry. It's a cargo. It's a trucks, bank, insurance. Lot of interconnection with the textile industry.
Jenny, is this a watershed moment? Is it a pivotal moment?
I can only say I hope so. We talk a lot about wake-up calls in this industry. Rana Plaza is forever referred to as a wake-up call for the industry. And because of that dramatic event, it did mobilize sufficient concern to be able to set up the accord and really once and for all address the structural safety issues in those factories that hadn't been, everybody knew about them, but there was no motivator for action. So, if we can work on what happened then, we could say, yes, there is a possibility of using this momentum. But I mean, it won't happen organically. People have to make it happen. There are companies that have much more of an interest in working on this, but there are many companies out there that don't. And this is part of the problem, because within this very cutthroat competitive environment where everybody's really competing on cost way too much rather than on, design or quality or whatever, there's a lot of cost competition in the industry. That sort of militates against the sort of cooperation that is needed to say, we have to change this business model, because once somebody starts, changing the model, they become individually uncompetitive. So it does require, and that's at the supplier level as well as at the brand level. So it does require a collective will to do things differently. But certainly in terms of amplifying the calls that have been there for many, many years from civil society, from organizations like your own, to say this is simply not sustainable.
Amina, what do you think?
I think that, post-crisis, while we're dealing with the immediacy of the impacts right now, I think when we come out of the crisis, consumers and governments and stakeholders are going to demand more that the industry, needs to be doing to address some of these systemic challenges. So I don't see that sustainability is going to go kind of to the back burner.
Mark, is it a pivotal moment?
And whether this is a pivotal moment, three things could happen, and which of those three will depend on decisions we make now. The first is we just sort of muddle through, and then somehow, in some clunky way, business goes, quote unquote, back to normal. I think that's not acceptable. I think the crisis highlights some underlying problems that have existed in the industry for a long time, such as pricing and lead times and so on. But it's possible. Many crises, this is the outcome. Then there are two other possibilities. One is things get worse, and the other is that we move in a more positive direction. So I want to end on a positive note. So let me start with the worst case scenario. And for me, the greatest fear is that when the dust settles, there'll be more consolidation at the top. And those businesses that stayed open, either because they were considered essential services. So we know a lot of mega supermarkets that also sell apparel are allowed to stay open in many cases, certainly in the US. And the others are the industries that had their biggest presence online. So those companies could capture much greater market share after the dust settles, and many others that were shut down, were not essential services, did not fully develop their online capabilities, will go out of business. And that consolidation at the top could lead to a greater squeeze down the supply chain on suppliers and workers. And that, to me, would be very worrisome. On the positive scenario, and I very much hope we move in this direction, is that this crisis pushes us, all of us, to rethink what was wrong with these supply chain relationships and dynamics and what needs to change. And those, from my view, what needs to change are the 4 points I outlined above: the pricing, lead time, order fluctuations, communication, and financial incentives. And I think we can move in that direction. We are almost at the exact 7-year point of Rana Plaza, right, which took place in 2013 in April in Bangladesh, when the building collapsed and over about 1,134 workers were killed. In the aftermath, we got one of the most ambitious programs for building safety, the Accord, that was followed by a second program, the Alliance. And knock on wood, we have not seen a catastrophe of that scale anywhere near it since then. And it was an audacious program because it forced buyers to make enormous compromises. They were subjecting themselves to something that was legally binding. There were clauses in it about cost sharing. There was communication and co-governance and transparency and so on. All those things came about as a result of that crisis. My fear is that the impact of this crisis could actually have a much greater cost in terms of human life and well-being, because there's so many more workers whose livelihood are now at stake. 4.1 million in Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands more in throughout Asia, India, Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador are big exporters relative to their economies. So we need to reflect on this crisis. We need to think about how to change things in the right direction. I do not think this is a matter of going back to business as usual. I think we have to make some fundamental changes, and I think this crisis forces us to do that.
That's it for now. Let us know what you think. Reach out to us at Big Closets at sustainablefashionacademy.org and stay safe.